with currency, money.
No.
You consider things like, what's the point of ownership? Period. All artists steal from all artists. Is that wrong?
No, I mean, I think that's exactly right. That all artists in every discipline that you can imagine end up working from the material around them, right? And they're inspired by the people around them. They're inspired by the history of their craft. It's a very natural thing. It's an instinct. And it's one reason that people often get caught copying other people's work or taking, and they'll say, I didn't even realize I did that. It's such a natural sort of process. And one of my arguments is that in the fashion industry, you're not sued because you do that. So the natural sort of creative impulse to draw from the material around you and to echo what's happening in the world right now is actually a legal process. But in the music industry, with painters, with filmmakers, they're really not in the same situation at all. And I'd say many of them complain bitterly because they do not have the opportunity to make the artwork that they want to make because they're afraid that they're going to be sued. But when it comes to the money side, I guess I wanted to make the point that a lot of people do equate ownership with money. Other people equate ownership with moral rights, right? I'm an author of something, I don't want people to mess with it, right? It needs to stay the way it is. And that's actually one reason that one of the Creative Commons licenses is that you can choose to apply. You can give up all kinds of the rights that copyright grants you, but you can claim you can't change this object. You can't alter it. You can share it with other people. It's going to have my name on it, and it has to look like this.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So my question is, just talking to you earlier and knowing your history about working with media and kind of just doing research with the masses, I was kind of wondering, thoughts came to mind that where do you think, from your research of everything you've done, where does the fashion come from? Does it come from the rich and the fashionable, or the poor and the fashionless, or the middle class and that just copy everyone? Where do you think most of that fashion comes from in our society?
Well, it really depends on the place. One thing that's really great about fashion is that it's very site-specific in a way. I mean, obviously we have a global fashion industry, but I can guarantee you the collection in one H&M is going to be different from the collection in another one, even across town. Yeah, I see people are nodding. So there's a sensitivity to geographic location, and I just read this really interesting report about the fashion industry in Rio. And what they wanted to do industry knock off the Carioca style of the Rio beach, bikini wear and all this stuff. How was that functioning? And what they found is that people were generally flatter when they were knocked off, and that they were very deeply influenced by the favelas. Those are the very poor barrios in the hills where people have very distinctive style, a style that the rich fashion designers in the expensive parts of Rio, like in Copacabana Beach, were actually inspired by. So they're basically making favela gangster wear, right, for really rich tourists who are coming to Copacabana. And that became sort of what Rio was about, sort of edgy, informal wear that's also extremely sexy. So in just that example, you can see how complicated the whole sort of creative ecology is. It's not just top down, it's not bottom up. There's a very interesting sort of mingling that occurs and helps really define the city. People think they know what Rio sort of means, and there's a whole fashion system in place there that tries to articulate that idea in clothing.
Dr. Blackley, I think you did a great job in explaining the democracy of style and this idea how we communicate with the outside world our style via clothing, and how access to clothing normally associated with the upper echelons of society is empowering. And I get that. I think you did a brilliant job in explaining that. One counterpoint, though, that I'm thinking of is the implications of not having intellectual property rights on developing countries. And how with these companies can afford to do that, but when we have creative people in developing countries that have these great styles, how companies can just come in and kind of take over, essentially, and take their clothing styles and mimic it, and because they have all the resources, they can easily mobilize it. And I'd like to get your thoughts on how intellectual property rights work versus developed countries and underdeveloped countries.
Well, it's a very interesting question, and I'm just surprised the direction that you took it, because usually most of the complaints go the other way. Is that it's first world countries that make very expensive, popular fashion designs that people in third world countries copy and knock off at will. And one of their biggest complaints among the big luxury designers is that it's in the second world and third world countries where you see the most piracy of trademarks, right? So that tends to be the big complaint, is that it's in the second and third world countries that they're taking full advantage of the lack of copyright and they're violating trademarks. But one interesting thing about textile design, a lot of people have, over the years, different fashion designers have become obsessed with certain kinds of textile designs from India or from Southeast Asia or from different regions in Africa. And one kind of interesting thing is that that's one thing that fashion designers actually do own, is the textile design. Because it's a two-dimensional design. It's an illustration, it's a painting, right? It's a drawing. And so people can actually enforce their copyright when it comes to textile design. And often that's the main thing that's coming out of countries like India and Africa in terms of influential fashion. And it's the fashion designers outside of those countries that are popularizing those textiles. But the people who made them actually should be remunerated. Yep.
Hi, Dr. Blackley. I have a two-part question. The first part you talked about...
Is the mic on? Can everybody hear you?
Can you hear me?
There we go.
There you go. Sorry. Thank you so much for your insight and sharing everything in this type of industry. I'm a graphic designer, and I've been doing this for about 15 years. And you're talking about how the industry moves so fast, and it's actually getting more accelerating. Have you noticed that there's like a high burnout, rate in this industry to where people come in and they come out? Can you give any insight on the sustainability on the creative industry just because it's moving so fast, and where do people go once they're burned out, or what do you do? Because you're in public policy and I'm looking to move forward in that type of industry, but where do you go and what do you do after you've been on the bottom side moving up and then you just hit that burned out? How do you get people to come up behind you and still sustain the industry, and still make it appealing?
Right. No, it's a really good question, and I must say one distinctive aspect of the fashion industry is that it is insanely fast-paced, and there's a huge amount of burnout. And so for certain kinds of creative people, this is the perfect industry for them. They're never bored. They always have a new idea. Whatever was cool yesterday is not cool today. I need to do something else. If you watch Project Runway, you'll see these personality types. So it definitely attracts a certain kind of personality type. But that's certainly not the only kind of fashion that succeeds. Some designers have found a very specific niche. Rick Owens, for instance, I don't know if you've heard of him. He makes a very sort of narrow palette of designs and a very specific design aesthetic. He barely changes anything each season, and he sells out every single item. He's just tapped into something that works for people. It's very wearable, it's very comfortable. He's probably my favorite designer. And he lives a very comfortable life in Paris. He bought the Italian factory that he used to have to... It's very hard for designers to get access to the really good factories. It's very much a pecking order, but he bought the whole damn factory. So he's just resting on his laurels. He doesn't have to worry about being pushed behind Prada or pushed behind Chanel. He's always first in line because he owns the factory. So there are certain success stories where you can see where people can sort of comfortably relax. But usually the only kind of stasis that you see in the fashion industry is among the highest level luxury brands. Right, Alexander McQueen killed himself recently. He's no longer alive. But his fashion label is thriving because the woman who worked with him, Sarah Burton, has taken over, and she's managed to keep articulating his vision. She's tapped into what it was about his style that people love, and she continues to keep that sensibility alive. And you find that with all the big fashion houses. They have a very particular sort of sensibility, and it's the responsibility of the team to keep it alive. And so there's a certain kind of trajectory of tradition, surprisingly, within certain echelons of fashion. But generally, for people coming in, it's terrifying. It's really fast-paced, roller coaster, crazy.
Thank you. I had a second part to that.
Oh, actually, we have some people back there. Afterwards, I'll talk with you afterwards. Okay. Thank you. Okay, back here.
Yeah, can you read? Okay. One of the last things I noticed you mentioned was the need for fostering multidisciplinary research. It's kind of crude, but you yourself seem a very cultured person with a lot of disciplinary studies. Yeah. So kind of a vague question, but what would you recommend for students trying to obtain the same thing, primarily research in pop culture, specifically, I suppose?
What would I suggest in terms of curriculum you take in order to prepare yourself for a bizarre career path like mine?
Yeah, what kind of recommendations would you make for someone looking to obtain the same goal?
Well, the key thing for me is I chose English because I thought it covered everything. Since literature was about everything, then I thought I could know a lot about everything. So that sort of suited me, but I felt very restricted by what a traditional academic pursuit it is. There's only specific journals you're supposed to publish in, and that really irritated me. And what really changed my life was when I first was introduced to the World Wide Web. You know, it was something that was new when I was in graduate school. And I decided that digital technology was going to change everything. And that's when I left academia, actually. So what I ended up doing is I got this really great education in understanding, being able to critically read the world. I learned how to read, I learned how to write really well, and then I went to a huge multimedia game company and I learned about digital technology. And it was like my second PhD. I always tell people that. So I think if you can marry together these very traditional skills, being able to communicate with people about very complicated things and in ways that show that you understand how to speak to an audience, right? That's part of my career, speaking to audiences, finding a way to build a bridge, right? Once you have that communication skill set, then I think it's really important that you learn the digital tools. You learn what technology is available to you to do your work. And once you have those two things in place, you can do anything. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your speech. It was truly the highlight of